Hi everyone. Check. All right. Let's play. Can you hear me? All right. We'll do a 1 hour Midnight Madness. By the way, I'm playing this collection of war files about the Philippines. I hope you enjoy it, okay? And let me know if you can hear it. Thank you.
And provides a fruitful field of study for those soldiers and laymen who seek in the past lessons for the future. Orlando Ward, Chief of Military History, 1952.
Nakinala mo niya sa oras. I noticed that first 3 games, ang bagal-bagal ko. Let's see what happens.
Mere hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces attacked the U.S. Commonwealth of the Philippines as part of its Pacific-wide plan to seize much-needed resources and Manila's strategically important harbor. Over the next 5 months, American and Filipino forces would conduct a stalwart defense of the islands that would cost many lives and end in defeat while disrupting Japan's plan for conquest in the region. By 7 December 1941, the Philippines, a chain of 7,000 islands in the Pacific, had been a U.S. territory for over 40 years. Located over 11,000 kilometers from San Francisco, but just under 3,000 kilometers from Tokyo, it was America's first line of defense against the threat of Japanese expansionism in the Pacific. With Japan already in control of the island of Formosa to the north, the Marshall, Caroline, and Gilbert Islands to the east, and
rematch tayo, rematch. Okay.
The U.S. military garrison in the Philippines was all that prevented Japan from consolidating its gains and driving south to seize the Dutch East Indies' valuable resources of oil and rubber.
It's 12:12. It's already Saturday. Guys, mag-ingat sa COVID-19 ha. Hindi biro ito, and people tend to become hasty pag natataranta sila, and ano-ano ginagawang desisyon, tatawa ka sa ibang desisyon, na naman magugulat ka ha, nakalusot yung ganun, diba? Things do happen, and be careful. Let's push that.
These included the Washington Naval Treaty, signed in 1922, which halted U.S. construction of new fortifications.
Let's see what
exchange
for
Japan
us.
limiting the size of its fleet. With only one reinforced stronghold set at the mouth of Manila Bay on the island of Corregidor, the Philippines' defenses were questionable.
Let's see what happens. Push natin to.
In the Navy's traditional way, without alliances. It expects to stand on its own feet in providing protection to the United States.
This realization was evident in the Joint Army and Navy's basic war plan for the Philippines. Updated in the spring of 1941, War Plan Orange 3 described a limited defense of the Philippines that focused primarily on denying an invader the use of Manila Bay. It also outlined a predetermined fallback plan for civilians and soldiers that acknowledged the difficulty of halting a Japanese invasion force that U.S. intelligence estimated could reach 300,000 troops in a month's time.
Nag-resign na. Rematch tayo. Hindi lang niya nakita yung anong yun. Battery ng Queen and Rook, no?
Okay.
Yan, alam nyo yung video na pinapapanood ko sa inyo. Galing yan sa Army University Press. Pinamigay lang niya.
A variation of a retrograde. A delay is when a force under pressure trades space for time by slowing down the enemy's momentum and inflicting maximum damage on enemy forces without becoming decisively engaged.
Dalawa pa. Let's see what happens here. Ah, ayun. Paalisin natin yung kabayo niya, ha. O, yan. Abangers yan.
In
Tingnan mo.
1935, the U.S.
Purong lang
Congress
tayo
voted to make
sandali.
the Philippines a
Yan, dito
commonwealth
yan.
with full autonomy at the end of a 10-year
Dito
transitional
tayo.
period. This change to self-governance shifted the responsibility for the defense of the
Oh,
islands
yo,
to the
talaga.
Philippines government and its people. However, it
Tingnan
complicated
natin
command
kung
and
paano
control
siya
and
tatakbo.
unity of effort
Ayun.
between U.S. forces and the Philippine
Nangyari
Army.
sa kanya. Oh,
In
yung kabayo
response,
niya
the
hanging,
Philippine
oh.
National Assembly
Hindi niya
voted to stand
nakita.
up a force of 10,000 soldiers, supplemented by
Kunin na natin
400,000
yan.
reserve troops. At the request of President Manuel Quezon,
kunin muna
Douglas
natin to.
MacArthur, recently retired from the U.S. Army,
Paano siya
was asked to
tatakbo?
oversee the creation of the
Dun
Philippine
siya.
Army
Sige.
as Field Marshal and
Laki ng
military
lamang
advisor
natin.
to the Commonwealth Government of the Philippines. From the start, MacArthur faced serious difficulties in training and preparing the Filipino forces for the
Ayun
future.
na.
With some 65 languages
Yan,
spoken
sige.
among them,
Tingnan natin yan.
Filipino troops were often unable to effectively communicate
Pwede
among
check.
themselves or with their
Tapos
leaders.
checkmate na naman.
Additionally, the absence of schools for
3097
commissioned
siya
and
ako.
non-commissioned officers
1430.
was a
Rematch. Pag
serious
pumayag,
obstacle
rematch.
to
Pag hindi,
standardizing
ayaw. Okay.
tactics, techniques,
By
and
the way, I'm
procedures
wearing this
across the highly
yellow
diverse force.
eyeglasses.
Severe shortages of
Masyado
weapons,
nang
uniforms,
lumabo
and
mata ko
housing
sa
also hampered the Philippine
Zoom
Army's
glasses
training and
natin.
preparation.
Wala
Such
namin,
handicaps
ano.
were magnified by the lack of military
As early as
vehicles,
March
permanent
15
roads
last
for
year. As early
transporting
as
soldiers.
March
A
9
feature
last
particularly
year, we
ominous
were
for forces
doing
tasked
virtual
with conducting
teaching.
a delay, where maintaining a mobility advantage over
We
the
were
attacking force
at least
is a
one
necessary prerequisite for success. These handicaps were complicated by a military
1 week
communication
ahead
infrastructure that relied heavily on
bago
unreliable civilian
mag-announce
telephone and
si
telegraph
Piduts
systems.
about
The Philippine Army, however, was not the only
the
military unit training on Luzon prior to the Japanese attack. In 1941, the U.S. Army's Philippine Department, under the command of Major General George Grunert, was headquartered out of
what's
Fort
that
William McKinley
about the
with over
uy,
22,000
patay
soldiers.
tayo.
Its
Tago
largest
tayo
unit,
dyan.
the Philippine Division, was
Hindi niya
commanded by Major
nakita
General
yung push.
Jonathan M. Wainwright and led by
Siyempre,
American
hindi.
officers.
Ba yan?
Though these two forces were originally intended to operate
Tago
independently,
tayo.
the U.S. forces under Grunert and the Philippine Army under MacArthur began combined training exercises in July 1941 as war with Japan
Ayun,
appeared
mati
more
na naman
likely.
to.
Japan,
Ba,
a
puro
member of the
ganun lang
Axis
mati ko
alliance,
ah.
had moved military units into French Indochina
Alright,
and assumed protectorate
so yeah,
status
I'm
over
wearing
the territory.
this.
For the two generals, this
Eh,
posturing
umalis
indicated
na.
that the Japanese could be preparing for
And
additional
almost
offensive operations in
1
Southeast
week
Asia
akong walang
and the South
production
Pacific.
dito sa channel natin.
Trouble always comes in threes.
May nangyari.
Take a good
Kakapagod
close
ang
look at
COVID,
this
ano?
trio.
Someone got COVID,
Remember
someone
these
died.
faces.
Pagod, and it's really
Remember them well. If you ever
threatening.
meet them, don't hesitate.
Intelligence analysts assess adversary actions and the posture of their
Ayaw.
forces to determine their intent and identify indications that can be used to
Saan siya
warn of a pending
tatakbo? Patay
attack.
ka.
Indications and
Sabi na
warnings
nga
are
ba,
tied to
doon ang
timelines
punta
that
eh.
inform commanders of how long before an adversary is capable of attacking and which
Saan
course of action they are
tatakbo?
likely to
Tago
pursue.
na nga muna tayo.
These timelines enable the planning and response framework to react in accordance with the severity of the indication and the estimated enemy course of action. Commanders can then execute measures
Uy,
to deter
ayaw.
the enemy from continued hostile acts while posturing friendly forces to respond
Ay,
if
mati!
deterrence fails.
Hindi ko nakita. Hindi na lang din niya nakita. Ano ba yan?
The occupation of French Indochina triggered a response from the United States designed to ward off
muna
further
tayo.
aggression by the Japanese. After placing a freeze on all U.S.-based Japanese assets, President
Yung
Franklin
pala,
Roosevelt
pwede.
then halted shipments of rubber, iron, and fuel to Japan and began planning for the military reinforcement of the Philippines.
President
Check
Roosevelt's
ulit.
actions, designed to deter further Japanese aggression in the region, are examples of
Tago
flexible
natin to.
deterrent options, or FDOs.
Yun, sabi na nga ba, mamimiss
FDOs are
niya. Ako nga
established
na-miss
to
niya.
deter actions before or during a crisis and may be used to prepare
Oh.
for future operations. They are developed and executed using each instrument of
Wala.
national power, diplomatic, informational,
Check.
military, and economic, but are most effective when used in concert.
Check.
FDOs provide options for decision makers during emerging crises
Pa.
to allow for gradual increases in pressure to avoid unintentionally
Check.
provoking full-scale combat, while simultaneously enabling leaders to develop the situation and gain a better understanding of an adversary's capabilities and intentions.
Already reeling under trade restrictions imposed the previous year, this action pushed the Japanese military leadership into a corner.
4.6 siya, haba ng
Lacking the
ano niya.
necessary materials to continue their plans for conquest, they made the decision to go to war by December 1941 if negotiations failed to reverse U.S. sanctions.
Ayaw na lumaban. Okay.
Sensing the coming conflict, President Roosevelt moved to defend the Philippines by combining the territorial Philippine Army with the U.S. Army units already stationed there. He then placed MacArthur in command of the newly combined force, designated as United States Army Forces Far East, or USAFE, and charged him with defending the islands. MacArthur was also recalled to active duty in the U.S. Army and was soon promoted to the rank of general. Earlier that spring, War Plan Orange 3 had been included as part of the National War Plan known as Rainbow 5. The National Plan was based on a recently signed agreement between the United States and Great Britain. This gave priority for supply and support to the war in Europe over all other areas of conflict. Establishing a timetable for completion by April 1942, the General's plan called for a reinforced defense that incorporated the island's natural terrain features to stop and repulse attacking forces on the beaches, while relying heavily on U.S. Army air power to actively attrit the enemy. By building his defense around the terrain and natural obstacles present on the island, General MacArthur illustrated a central tenet of defensive operations.
According to Army doctrine, the commander always takes advantage of the terrain when planning how to position forces and conduct operations. The terrain dictates where a delaying force can orient on a moving enemy force and ambush it. A commander conducting operations in compartmentalized terrain selects locations that restrict the enemy's movement and prevent the enemy force from fully exploiting its combat superiority.
Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall was personally familiar with the Philippines,
It's
and after reviewing MacArthur's plan, authorized
Saturday,
the transportation of the essential supplies and reinforcements that he had requested.
Ayaw. Next tayo. Yun.
To reinforce the Philippines, Army leadership deployed several National Guard units. The 200th Coastal Artillery Regiment and the 192nd and 194th Tank Battalions
bukas na lang
equipped
tayo.
with M3 Stuart tanks.
Bukas na
MacArthur also received
lang.
reinforcements for his air arm to include P-40 Warhawk fighter planes and B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. However, shortages in shipping space meant that some items were delayed or did not arrive.
Yun.
In one instance, air crews arrived in Manila ahead of their aircraft just before the start of hostilities in December. Since delivery of their A-24 Banshee dive bombers never occurred, these airmen spent the rest of the war fighting as infantry. To compensate for his lack of updated equipment and well-trained personnel, MacArthur's plan relied heavily on close integration with the Filipino forces. Recalling all 10 divisions of the Philippine Army from reserve for training and refitting, he task organized them into 5 distinct forces. The North Luzon Force, under the command of Major General Wainwright, defended strategically important areas of Luzon. These included the only beaches wide enough and deep enough to accommodate a large-scale amphibious landing. The North Luzon Force also had responsibility for the Bataan Peninsula, War Plan Orange's designated fallback area should the Japanese invasion prove unstoppable. Organizationally, the North Luzon forces consisted of the horse-mounted 26th Cavalry Regiment and the 1st Battalion, 45th Infantry, both of which were fully equipped and extensively trained Philippine scouts. These units were accompanied by 2 batteries of 155mm artillery and 1 battery of 2.95
Ooh, checkmate by Castling! Did you see that? Checkmate by Castling, ayaw na.
Wainwright's command. MacArthur planned to support the North Luzon
Subukan
Force
nga
with
natin
the
to.
Philippines' 71st Infantry Division, held in reserve at Manila.
Check, ayaw.
This division could only
Control
be
the
released
middle lang
with MacArthur's
tayo,
permission.
or occupy the
Following
middle.
war, Wainwright recalled the situation when he took over
eh.
command of the North Luzon Force.
Basic guiding principles daw in playing the game.
On the eve of the attack.
Lalong-lalo na
Infantrymen
sa
trained on an average of 3 to 4 weeks before being
GM
forced to
level.
fight.
Uy, bakit siya
Engineers
pumunta
got no
doon?
training at all. Artillery never fired a practice shot.
Ayun na.
Indeed, its first shot
Oops.
was aimed at the
Kailang,
general
sayang.
direction of the approaching enemy.
Yun.
Over an area 75 miles from north
Yan.
to south and 100 miles from east to west. But the only means of communication with the various divisions was through
Yung
the public
sequence
telephone
tama
lines.
ba? Naku, lalo pa niyang
The South
inano.
Luzon Force, commanded by Brigadier
ito
General
tayo.
George M. Parker Jr., was responsible for
Ayun,
defending a
ito.
zone covering the
Dagdag
capital of
presyo.
Manila all the way south to the tip of Luzon.
Ay, dun nga.
His forces were comprised of two Philippine Army infantry divisions, the 41st and 51st, that found themselves in the same
Dito ba
training
siya?
and equipment shortage
Ayun.
situation as the North Luzon Force. They were supplemented by a battery from the
Check.
86th Field Artillery of the Philippine Scouts. MacArthur's Third Force was organized
Check.
to defend the Visayan
Yun.
Mindanao
Bumuka yung
Islands
ano
area.
Bishop
It fell under the
ko.
command of
Yun.
Brigadier
Diba?
General William F.
Bumuka
Sharp,
yung bishop
included
ko
three Philippine Army
Sequence
infantry
lang.
divisions,
Sequence lang
61st,
guys ng
81st,
moves, no?
and 101st.
Well, takes time
The Harbor Defense Force, under the command of
to
Major
realize
General George
these
F. Moore,
ideals.
was MacArthur's Fourth Force, and was
Kunin ko
comprised
siya.
of 4 regiments of
Ayun
coastal
sana.
artillery
Ayun, check.
and 1 regiment
Kuha
of
ko
air
yung
defense
bishop niya.
artillery. The fifth
Sinaraduhan
and
pa niya.
final
Hindi siya
force,
nakabalik.
located
Di
north
ba?
of Manila, was the reserve
Ayun.
force,
Kuha
under
lang.
MacArthur's direct
Tactics lang
command.
pa rin, di ba? Uy.
Along with USAFE headquarters,
May
the
ipit tayo
reserve's
dyan. Dito
operational
pa rin.
forces consisted of the Philippine 91st Division and the
Yun.
U.S. Philippine Division
Kunin natin
consisting
dun.
of 3 infantry regiments
Tapos
and
bukas
the
natin.
Division
Uy.
Artillery or
Ayos to.
DIVARTY. It
Ano
also
na?
included the 1st Provisional Tank
Bukas
Group,
na siya.
consisting of 2 tank battalions.
Uy, hindi kinuha.
Rounding out General MacArthur's command was the Far East Air Force, commanded by Major General Lewis H. Brereton, which, in December of
Ay, nangyayari
1941,
tayo
was the
rito.
largest concentration
May
of Army
night siya
airborne aircraft outside of the
Sabi na nga
continental
ba eh.
United States. Logistical support, including food,
Okay
ammunition,
na.
weapons, and medical supplies, were transferred
Siya
from
ako
depots
kuha.
on Bataan and the island of Corregidor and distributed to each defending force.
Ayun, kuha na.
This was done to support MacArthur's desire to defend as far
Ay,
forward
magandang
as
tira.
possible. The
Queen
16th
pa
Naval
rin, oy.
District, under the command of Rear Admiral Francis W. Rockwell, was also a vital part of the defense force. With installation at Cavite, Olongapo, and Corregidor, it included
Sorry,
cruisers,
kamali
destroyers,
siya ron.
submarines,
Kung ano nangyayari dyan sa
and the 4th Marine
Philippine
Regiment.
history natin through the
Though under
war
orders to
files.
assist in
Ayaw
the
na.
defense of the Philippines, it
Ganda
remained
dyan, ganda
independent
ng
of
analysis.
USAF,
Kaya lang I
and
don't
instead
agree
reported to
everything
the
with
US
what the
Asiatic
Americans
Fleet, headquartered in Manila,
are saying
under the
about the
command of Admiral
Filipinos.
Thomas C. Hart. A
For
testament
sure,
to the
malaki
early growing
tulong ng
pains
mga
associated with
Filipino
creating a joint
guerrillas
force.
during the war
This lack of a
sa
unified command
sa
was
mga
not unique
sa
to the
mga
Philippines
Americans.
and plagued U.S.
BS
operations
yun.
throughout
Pag
much of the Pacific
naniwala ka
campaign.
na
For MacArthur and Rockwell,
walang
it upset
naitulong
unity
ang
of
mga
effort
Pinoy na
and further
sundalo.
complicated their defense of
May
the
kuha
island.
yun, no? Libre. Kunin natin yan. Ay, ayaw.
Running low on resources in the summer of 1941, the Japanese
Ay,
prioritized the
check
seizing of the
tayo.
Dutch
Di ba,
East
tago
Indies
na.
and the Malay Peninsula ahead of all other goals.
We were in their way. We had
Kukunin
to
na
be
naman
removed.
tayo dun. Sarado na nga. Oops,
Japanese
oops,
way.
oops.
To do this,
Yun ang
they
mga
understood
delikado,
that the
boy.
U.S. naval forces stationed at Pearl Harbor needed to be
Mga
neutralized.
master,
and the
sasabihin
threat
sa'yo.
from U.S. naval and air power
Delikading.
in the
Mga
Philippines
delikading
had to
yan.
be addressed.
Ayun
Deciding on its final
lang.
attack plans in
Ito kaya
mid-November,
kunin ko.
Japanese Imperial General
Kuha natin
Headquarters
yan.
assigned Lieutenant
Ay,
General
doon. Ganun
Masuharu
pa rin.
Homa and his 14th Army to conquer the Philippines. Lieutenant General Homa's army
Ayun.
was made up of the 16th and
Kuha na
48th
siya.
Infantry
Buksan
Divisions,
natin yung
augmented with
B-file.
additional armor regiments and mountain artillery
Buksan
brigades.
natin. Wala na.
Although they were
Dito na
called
tayo.
regiments,
Oops.
Japanese armor regiments
Ito
were
na.
equivalent to American armor battalions, and
Oh,
Japanese
check na.
tanks were of poor quality, their
Tapos,
medium tank being smaller than the American Stuart
maganda.
light
Ito,
tank.
check ulit.
The
Wala na.
Japanese invasion of the Philippines was planned down to the
Matin
hour,
eh.
and by integrating land, sea, and air power, they quickly overwhelmed U.S. and Filipino forces, establishing several key lodgements. Japanese plans called for the complete destruction of the Far East Air
Bishop.
Force and the seizure of
Makaisa.
several key
Sige nga,
airfields
knights
throughout the
muna.
island chain.
Uy.
This would give the
Kuha.
Japanese air superiority, enabling
Oy,
Homa's
teka lang,
divisions
teka
to
lang, teka lang.
attack
Sarado
without being
natin.
harassed from the air.
Yan.
To do this, Japanese infantry would seize the key airfield on Bataan Island north of Luzon, while fighters and bombers
Hindi ko
stationed
alam.
on
Bigay
Formosa
natin.
would attack airfields on Luzon. Japanese infantry would then continue to
Kukunin
other
niya ng
fields at
ayun.
Apari, Vigan,
Tayo.
and Legazpi further south, culminating with the seizure of the airfield at
Yoko nga.
Davao on the large island of Mindanao, south of Luzon. With air superiority established
Ayaw.
and several airfields secured, the 14th Army would be free to begin its main landings on Luzon.
Kamali
The
tayo ron.
14th Army's main effort would then come ashore at Lingayen Gulf, some 200 kilometers north of
Yan
Manila,
na.
and begin attacking
Wala.
towards the capital. A smaller force would land at Lamon Bay, 120 kilometers south of Manila, and proceed north to link up with the larger force in a combined assault on the city. After capturing the capital, the Japanese could then seize Manila Bay
Hirap din
and defeat
gumawa.
any remaining
Yes, ah.
U.S. and Philippine forces on Luzon, placing them in firm control of the largest and most important island
Ano
in
ba
the
to?
Philippines. The attack on Pearl Harbor signaled the start of the invasion of the Philippines. U.S. Asiatic Fleet headquarters in Manila was the first to be notified at 0230
Kala
hours
ko
local time
malulusutan
on
pa
8
tayo dun.
December. General MacArthur, however, was not notified of the event until an hour later when his chief of staff heard the news over the radio. MacArthur immediately put his troops on alert.
Push tayo pag
Attacked
hindi
4
gumawa.
months earlier than
Ayun.
intelligence estimates predicted,
Pupush
MacArthur had
yan, isa
only a
pa.
fraction of the necessary equipment and
Sa-
supplies he
yan
needed
natin.
to defend the Philippines.
Kaya
As
siya
the Japanese
tatakbo.
began their invasion, the majority of MacArthur's
Baka
soldiers,
na pupush.
and in
Uy,
particular the
nakalusot tayo
Philippine
isa.
Army troops,
Piso-piso
lacked
lang,
even
no?
the most basic necessities, from boots and
Piso-piso
helmets
lang,
to
babe.
serviceable rifles and ammunition. More importantly, they lacked the training necessary to fight as units in the field. In
Ay,
contrast,
kukuha.
the
Saan tayo
Japanese forces
tatakbo?
were better trained and well equipped, with units having
Kaya,
prior
push
battlefield
natin to.
experience obtained during the ongoing Sino-Japanese War. Concerned that his airfields and
Ayoko
aircraft
ibigay,
might
ah.
suffer the same fate as those in Hawaii, Major General Brereton requested permission for his B-17s to begin bombing the Japanese
Abang
airfield on
makulit
Formosa.
ka.
However, due to delays and
Takunin natin.
miscommunication
Sige,
between
bigay
Brereton
na
and
natin.
MacArthur's staff, Brereton's fighters and bombers did not mount an attack against Formosa. Instead, Japanese fighters and
So,
bombers
walan tayo
based
ng
only
forma
800
dun, ah.
kilometers away on Formosa arrived over
Push
Clark
lang yan,
and
oh.
Iba airfields. With little opposition from antiquated anti-aircraft guns, the enemy
Hindi na
attacked
natin
both facilities,
papormahin yan.
destroying their radar equipment and strafing or bombing the aircraft that had been holding for permission to attack the Japanese.
Sarado natin yan.
According to plan, Japanese infantry
Ah,
landed
check.
unopposed on Bataan Island that same morning.
Uy,
They then
isa pa.
proceeded to seize and secure the U.S.
Check.
airfield located there and to establish a base for their short-range fighters. More importantly, the destruction of over half of Army Air Force assets at Clark and
Nag-resign na.
airfields
Naubos ko siya.
established Japanese air
Ayan po,
superiority
ano.
over the
Alright.
Philippines
Ganda
on the
laro
first day
natin
of the
ngayon,
war.
ah. Kaya lang 1457 siya. ah. Kagaya ko, beginner level. Saan siya pupush?
The next day,
Atras tayo
9
pagka, ay, ayaw.
Japanese
Tingnan
bombers
natin
from
to.
Formosa struck Nichols Field, destroying more aircraft and seriously damaging the installation.
Support.
Opposition was light. Understanding
Sarado
that his ships
natin
could
yung
not
ano.
expect protection from aerial attack, Admiral Hart dispatched the majority of his fleet
Ayun.
south to Australia.
Kunin natin to. Tsaka
Following
to.
their departure, the Japanese attacked the naval facilities at Kabiti on 10 December.
Yung.
As Kabiti burned, Japanese infantry, supported by naval aircraft
Yun
and
ang
gunfire
maganda.
from the Japanese fleet, landed on Kamigan Island north of
Kaso
Luzon.
malayo pa
The
yan.
few U.S. aircraft left
Sarado
operational
muna natin
attacked
to.
units of
Uy,
the 2nd Formosa Regiment
meron
as it
pala
came ashore
ron.
at Vigan and
nakita
Apari,
yun, oh.
sinking one Japanese minesweeper and damaging 4 other vessels,
Sarado natin to.
comprised of 3rd Battalion and half of the 1st Battalion, 2nd Formosa
Hindi
Regiment.
nakita yun.
The 2,000-strong
Mali.
Kano detachment came ashore at Vigan. Another
Abo,
similarly
talaga
sized
na
force,
pa.
known as the Tanaka detachment, comprised of the 2nd Battalion and the other half of 1st Battalion, 2nd Formosa Regiment, attacked at Apari. These multiple landings were supported by 2 heavy cruisers,
Saan ba
2
ito galing?
destroyers,
Ay,
and defensive counter-air provided by fighter aircraft from Bataan Island.
tayo.
Over the next few
Sayang.
days, the 2 detachments broke out from their initial lodgements at Apari and Vigan and began moving south
Saan ako
towards
ng
Manila
oras doon?
along the coast on Route 3. On 12 December, 2,500 Japanese soldiers, known as the Kimura Detachment, came ashore approximately 500 kilometers southeast of Manila at Legazpi. General Parker,
talo
commander
tayo
of the
sa
Southern
oras.
Luzon Force, sent untried
Okay.
elements from the
Okay, let's
41st
see.
and 51st Philippine Army
King's
divisions
Gambit. Let's
to
see.
counterattack. But these were soon routed by the better trained Japanese.
Thank you.
After
Bishop.
successfully seizing its objective at Legazpi, the
Saan siya
Kimura
pupunta?
Detachment began its march north on Route 1
Okay na.
to link up with
Sa
the forces
pang-push
landing
na-
at Lamon Bay for the advance on
Ayan
Manila.
eh. Dito siya tatakbo eh. Yun. Ayan na. Ayan na. Kailangan niyang kumuha. Yun. Ayaw.
Keeping to Lieutenant General Homa's timetable for the taking of the Philippines, enemy landings until now had been minor incursions. However, on 22 December, Homa's main effort came ashore
natin.
along the Lingayen Gulf.
Yun. Kuha natin.
Comprised of
Ay.
the entire Japanese 48th Division, with attached
ganun
elements
din.
of the 16th Division, Homa's
Sige.
Lingayen force totaled just over 40,000 soldiers. Following a carefully timed plan that called for landings at 3 different locations along a 24-kilometer stretch of the Gulf, the first wave of
Kunin
Japanese
natin.
landing craft approached the beaches at 0500. Beginning in the south, units of the 47th Infantry Regiment and elements of the 48th Mountain Artillery landed at the village of Aguu. Overcoming rough seas and weak resistance from unseasoned units of the 11th Philippine Infantry Division, the Japanese landed most of their forces with minimal loss. The middle landing was conducted by units of the 1st Formosa Infantry Regiment and elements of the 48th Mountain Artillery at the village of Arangay. The landings were virtually unopposed, and the 1st Formosa troops soon turned south on Route 3 to join their comrades of the 47th Infantry Regiment who had landed at Aguu. The final landing, 2 hours later, by units of the Kamijima Detachment, composed primarily of the 9th Infantry Regiment, occurred further north at the village of Bawang. Moving ashore through rough waters, they briefly encountered stiff resistance from troops of the 12th Philippine Infantry Regiment before seizing the village. Breaking out from their lodgment, they dispatched patrols along Route 3 to make contact with Colonel Tanaka's detachment as it came south along the road. Advancing against light resistance, a unit of the Kamijima Detachment attacked
Bakit yung
along the
panalo ko niya?
Bawang-Baguio Road that ran to Rosario through the
Ay.
Cordillera Mountains
Push.
and then seized the airfield at
Sabi ko na
Naguilian.
eh.
The enemy's success forced the 71st Philippine Regiment and elements of the 11th
Kabayo
Philippine
yan
Division to withdraw. Meanwhile, the main body of the Kamijima Detachment seized the village of Baguio further east to prevent U.S. forces from outflanking the landing force and to act as a rear guard for the Japanese advance on Manila. As the enemy began its move inland, Wainwright's 21st Division defended the southern shores. This left the soldiers of the 26th Cavalry Philippine Scouts, led by Colonel Clinton A. Pierce, to defend against Japanese movements south along Route 3 from the village of Puzurobio. Advancing south along Route 3, Colonel Hifumi Imai's 1st Formosa Regiment and elements of the 48th Mountain Artillery received little opposition from the inexperienced and lightly armed 11th Division as they advanced towards the village of Dam Ortiz.
Ay,
Along the
panalo
way,
tayo.
they linked up with the 48th Reconnaissance 9th Infantry Regiment and the
241
4th Tank
yun.
Regiment. Both had come ashore earlier north of Dam Ortiz. After advancing out of Aguu, Colonel Isamu Yanagi's 47th Infantry and a battalion of the 48th Mountain Artillery
Yan,
faced
safe.
weak resistance from a battalion of the 11th Infantry Division, which then retreated to Dam Ortiz. Aware of the growing advance on Dam Ortiz, General Wainwright ordered the 26th Cavalry to move from Puzurobio through Rosario and onto Dam Ortiz to aid in its defense. When the 26th Scout
Ba't
Car
ang
Platoon
kalabang
arrived
ko?
at Dam Ortiz, they found the town unoccupied. The platoon then moved north on Route 3, where it made contact with the Japanese 48th Reconnaissance and 4th Tank Regiment. Unable to advance, the platoon returned to Dalmartis, where the 26th Cavalry was ordered to hold in a delaying action should a force withdrawal.
Alright,
North
it's
Luzon force become
12:40
necessary.
and I think we have to end on that. Thank you for joining me for a bit. Bye-bye.
In response, Colonel Pierce asked for additional support from General Wainwright.